you may not know, whose work you've probably seen, heard, or read without realizing. We dig into how they got here, the twists, the detours, and what's driving them now. Today, I'm in conversation with Thomas-tait.
I don't know if I was thinking about career at that age. When I was 5 years old, I just was obsessed with all these. Five was a very pivotal moment in my life where I had, up until the age of five, been sort of given freedom at home to um, play with the kinds of toys that I was interested in and play dress up. And I was obsessed with all things what we would call girly, So, but at the age of five, my parents made a kind of executive decision to cut that out of my life. And that was a really important moment for me where um, the thing that kind of sparked the most amount of joy, whether that be a Barbie or playing dress up or any of those kinds of things, kind of like became taboo without any real explanation. So I think at that stage I was maybe grappling with that more than I was thinking about a career or what I might be growing up. But in a way, it kind of like only further whet my appetite for all things beauty and fantasy and things that we now understand in less of a binary way, but I guess at the time would have just been considered to be things for girls.
And if I may ask, what kind of worlds did you used to create, or what kind of fantasies did you used to make with that?
I think I think initially there was a sort of attraction to the image of things. So it's like I was fascinated by girls. I was fascinated by the princess in the Disney film, and I was always interested in not just the princess, but any kind of strong leading female role in cartoons or in movies, and the kind of things that you would find in a toddler's media diet. And I guess there definitely was a through line of like having not just an invested interest in those kind of like strong female characters or in leading female characters, but also in having an opportunity to have some kind of authorship of a sort of like life narrative. So I was always sort of like in my mind, it was like, well, why would I play with a car? Because a car can't have a relationship with another car. But this doll, or what eventually became action figures in my case, because those were permitted, you can make them have relationship and have social dynamics and stories. So I think it was like, yeah, I was a lot more interested in the humanity of it, of what people look like, how that influences the way they show up in front of another, and the relationship that they have.
And then they take those away, and then they bring you action figures? Is that what happened?
I don't really remember. I do remember there was a sort of like replacement set of toys where I had a wooden toolbox and a truck and cars and things like that kind of arrived. Um, and I never really used any of them or played with them, so I imagine they must have stayed rather immaculate. But in my toolbox, there was a sandpaper. There was a wooden block that was covered in sandpaper, which I used on my own face. I don't know, out of boredom. And I remember, and I ended up sandpapering my chin once. And it felt fine at the moment. And then later in the day, my chin was on fire, and I couldn't realize why. And I ended up getting a really gnarly scab on my chin. Yeah, so I mean, those kinds of toys arrived. But what happened is that I then I then went into enjoying the things that I like, such as dolls and such as playing dress up and stuff, but doing it secretly, so it was something that became a hidden part of my life. So I understood that it was something that I couldn't do in front of my parents, and I couldn't allow people outside of the home know that is an interest of mine. So kids at school weren't aware of it, and it became a sort of secret, like it became a secret identity in a way. So these kinds of things were both this kind of very, very pure source of joy, but then equally a source of shame. So it became this very kind of dynamic, and now as an adult, I can see rather complex relationship, which I think I will likely always have an element of that dynamic of shame and pleasure combined in that world. But yeah, I guess I remember would sneak a doll that would be in this sort of communal. We had a playroom because I have two older siblings, so we'd have a sort of rec room, if you wish, where the TV lived and things like that, and there were toys there, and I would sneak a Barbie up into my bedroom and then would go and go to the bathroom and get toilet paper, and then I would make clothes on the Barbie with toilet paper, and I would wet the toilet paper so that it would stick onto her body, and I would mold it into a shape. Which is, on one hand, remarkably creative to be that young and to be sort of essentially kind of draping and molding and sculpting things onto a miniature dress form, but also kind of sad that you're using wet toilet paper as a form of amusement whilst, literally hiding in your closet.
Yeah, that's not very nice. I remember I was I sort of had sort of not same issue, but I kept having toys until a really late age, I think, and kept bringing those toys to school. And granted that I was being, I always wonder why I used to get bullied. It's like, oh my god, it was so easy to understand why I was being bullied. But at the same time, it's like
that? What were the sort of in your mind? What are the obvious signifiers for a bullying target for you?
I think it was more of the fact that I was, I was always dreaming. I was always coming up with things. I had a mind that was full of ideas, and what was happening in school wasn't really interesting. And so I would much rather live in the fantasy of my toys and the things, and the same thing as you,
Yeah.
telling the stories and the elements of it.
Yeah.
And obviously, at that point, between 11, 12, kids are more interested about beating the crap out of each other or playing, with playing basketball, playing something. And I was still good at sports, but it was just one of those things of, and I was a nerd and I was already coding. So, it's I had all the red flags of what it meant to be bullied in school. So then in what moment or what, in which, how old were you when you realized, what, actually, I really enjoy this and I want to find a career within this type of world?
I think that took a while. There were definitely career-wise, there were different things that I became interested in over the years. But I guess looking back at it, that sort of, I grew up in Montreal or just outside of Montreal, and the winters in Canada are very long, and in particular in Quebec they're very, very cold, and I never liked the heat. I never liked the cold, and I still don't. And I remember because in Canada we were raised French speaking, and we only knew how to speak French until we went to school. So my father's British, and so they put us in English schools from the age of 5. But until that moment, we hadn't been taught any English at all. So we were purely French-speaking children, and then we went to English school. And And then very quickly that became the sort of dominant language, especially amongst myself and my two older siblings, and eventually with our dad as well. And and so at a relatively young age, our media diet became Anglophone, became English speaking. So we wouldn't really watch, French Canadian television or cartoons. We would watch English speaking ones, which for the most part in Canada, or at least at the time, was American. So our media diet was very much American. And at an early age, I became obsessed with this idea of California. And I guess a part of it was sort of like seeing so many TV shows and movies, especially young people being shot in California, and seeing what high school or grade school is for them, and they have their lockers outdoors, and it's seemingly summertime, and there's palm trees, and so I was really, really envious of that. And so the idea of California and the life of being in LA, and that this idea that I had of it became really, really captivating. So at an early age, I knew that no matter what I was going to do, I was going to likely go somewhere else. I was going to move to another country, or go somewhere where maybe the climate is a little bit more forgiving. And I was definitely interested in everything that was sort of like visual storytelling. So, of course, as a young child, I didn't know about high fashion or fashion design, and it wasn't something that culturally was like in my environment. Neither of my parents were ever interested in that, and we grew up in a sort of like middle class Canadian suburb that was, didn't really have much going on other than, golf courses. So, yeah, it wasn't necessarily, the connection to fashion wasn't something that happened quickly. It's really something that evolved over a long period of time. But yeah, I think that really early on is that visual storytelling, image, beauty, and I guess the sort of theater of image was captivating for me. And and then it was only really, I think there were also elements of shame that kept me away from embracing it completely. I was always unable to present myself in any way other than what I'm like now. And I mean, until I was about maybe 20, most people who met me thought I was a girl. So it wasn't really something that I couldn't show up at school like the other boys, even if I tried. And I also didn't want to. I didn't really look at my peers, my male peers, and think I want to be like them. I envied, I envied being able to I envied the other boys for their ability to show up at school and not be treated differently. But I also didn't necessarily want to emulate them. So I don't know if you call that defiance or whatever, but I always embraced my stylistic preferences. I always enjoyed having fun with clothes, and within the parameters that were permitted for me by my parents and the school I went to, and I guess society at the time in that area, I pushed things as far as I could. So I was constantly playing with my hair and constantly playing with my clothes, and also it became a little bit of a social study in a way. It was very interesting. I think really I started paying very close attention to it at the age of 9, where I guess at that age we were old enough to start to understand the power that your image has on another person. And I started to notice at the age of 9 that some of the boys in my class would want to know where I bought something. So it kind of graduated from just being something that people made fun of, like the way I looked or how I chose to dress myself, which, you know, continued throughout my life until I moved to London. But at the age of 9, I started noticing how some of the boys went past the ridicule and actually tapped into a curiosity, and how you choose to dress yourself has an influence on how people see you and ultimately how you're treated. Um, and so I think that's kind of really my first sort of significant unlock when it comes to the power of clothes and design and fashion design. Um, and you also have to keep in mind when I, I went to high school from the year 2000 to 2005. And I think that's really sort of like post 90s where we shifted from a time where there were very clear sort of cultural signifiers or trends or movements that happened from one decade to another. And really in 2000 and the millennium, things kind of shifted where it was less obvious to sort of look at, you know, 2000 to 2010 and put a label to it. And in a way that you could say grunge in the 90s or heroin chic of the 90s, or looking at the 80s and thinking about, you know, power dressing and punk. So yeah, it was a time where consumerism became a bigger thing, where status dressing and media and with the introduction of the internet and having so much more access to information from all sorts of different parts of the world at your fingertips, and being able to sort of learn about subcultures from a different part of the world very quickly, all of that became available to us as children and as adolescents, and I think that only further fueled a sort of dynamic and experiential exploration of dress and creative expression and sort of personal world building, at least for me.
What were you listening to, or what were you watching? What were you reading at the time?
Um, so I listened to, I mean, this is also like in high school where the iPod came in. And so I had an iPod really early on, and I had to have one. And it was so nice because you could just block out the noise and just live inside. Looking back at it, I was a really melancholic child, a melancholic teenager, where I would listen to a lot of Sigur Rós. As a teenager, I was constantly listening to them. I listened to a huge amount of Elliott Smith. Um, yeah, just terribly sad music, really, for the most part. I mean, I also, you know, this was also like era of Britney and Christina and Justin and you know, and the Rough Riders um, and also, you know, this kind of white middle class suburban kids listening to hip hop and rap and not, and this was before people really grasped, you know, the line that rightfully exists between, you know, enjoying something and appropriating something. And so there was definitely a lot of cringe going on at school as well, of, you know, appropriating Black culture in a white, you know, middle class environment. Um, but yeah, so but I was definitely I was also like constantly hunting for. I would hear something like in a movie, like just a few seconds of a song, or hear something in a TV commercial, and this was before Shazam and before being able to. So I spend a lot of time hunting for things that I didn't have much information on. And this was like Napster time, and you know, where you'd have to go and find torrents and stuff. So, and this was before YouTube, and yeah. So I guess I spent a
Hey,
lot.
listen, You had it easier. We used to sit by the radio on the cassette, and as soon as the song started, recording the song in the cassette, so I can actually have it that way.
Yeah,
And then it was the worst part was the radio DJ always spoke in the middle, or speak in the middle of it, or would cut in the middle. It was just like horrible because you were always hunting for those songs.
yeah. So I mean, it was like, yeah, there were definitely certain things. Like I said, like I listened to a lot of Icelandic music. I listened to Sigur Rós a lot. I listened to Mum a lot. And those were the kind, and Elliott Smith, and I would listen to, those are the kinds of things that I could just let it play and listen to the whole album. But then there was also this whole other mashup on my iPod, which was incoherent in that it was just a long list of things that weren't necessarily organized, and they tended to be sort of like, I like this specific song from this artist, or I like this thing, and and it was always just kind of like a messy collage of content that I had picked up from different places that didn't really, I mean, it was more like building your own soundscape rather than it was having a sort of thoughtful, vested interest in one particular music genre or a specific artist. And I think, and just how in every respect, I think I was always like that, and I am to an extent still like that, where it's like I'm not I'm never all about this or all about that. I've never been able to identify as like I'm a metalhead, or I'm all about rap, or I'm all about goth, or I'm all about one thing or the other. And I think it's also, I am a product of the times that I was brought up in, where we suddenly had the floodgates of the internet opened, and then, in my formative years transitioning into adult life is when we were then kind of, the next wave of social media came in and accelerated, content and information, and how we consume creative work. So yeah, it's always been such a mixture. I always find that interesting when people ask me those like very clear questions of like, what kind of music do you like? And it's like, well, I like all kinds of music. And it's very, very little that I can't find enjoyment in whatsoever.
What was your room like when you were in high school?
Oh. Well, we moved actually. So my room, it transformed. So when I was in high school, my parents bought this very, very old house that had all this red tape around it in terms of construction. So it was in a sort of historical neighborhood. And I think they maybe had a different plan when they bought it, and then financially things changed for them, and their ability to have it properly renovated was no longer. And so we ended up renovating it ourselves as a family, which was a huge amount of work that I certainly didn't sign up for, and neither did my siblings. And we, of course, didn't have any idea what we were doing. So for a good, I'd say the majority of my adolescence, my room was either changing location in the house because we were working on one area of the house, and it would shift the setup of the house depending on what we were working on, and or I was living in a room that was in process of renovation. And in the end, they never finished renovating it. My parents ended up getting a divorce, and my mom eventually sold the house unfinished. But yeah, that was pretty much my high school years, was living in that very old house in process of renovation. So I don't think I ever really got to a point where I had something that you could actually sort of turn into your own space, because it was in flux for so many years. And then when I did eventually have a bedroom, that was the renovation in that room was done, and I had this new room to have. a part of me also wanted to keep it kind of pristine because it was the only room in the house that was completely new. It was a room that was built on a flat roof that so it didn't exist before. So it was an entirely new room, and I think I wanted to keep it quite minimalist and pristine. And then I also doubt that I would have had the right to put anything on the walls anyway, because of the amount of work and pain that we had gone through to renovate the house. So yeah, I mean, it was, nothing remarkable. But again, I've always continued to be that way. I'd like to have more things on the walls in my house here. But I've never really been one to put things on walls. And um, either because it's a bit like getting a tattoo. Like, I'm not going to get a tattoo because I know I'm not going to like it soon enough. Anything that I have to look at that regularly, I tend to get sick of. And, when I started my brand, for example, people would always ask, like, well, where's the mood board? And there just never was one. And, and I don't typically work in that way. And also, I just know that if I make something kind of permanent or semi-permanent in that way, like making it a fixture in a room that whether I intend to or not, I can see it, I kind of just get a little bit annoyed with it. So yeah, I guess I don't call myself a minimalist, but I understand why some people might think that of me if they come to my home.
Okay. And so what point do you decide, well, I kind of like this storytelling, I kind of like this clothing thing, maybe I should study something about fashion?
Yeah.
Or did you study graphic design before? Or did you go to art school?
No,
what was your process to?
I actually wanted to go and do law when I was in high school, and I took a sort of extracurricular class in criminal law, and I didn't like that. I liked debate team, I liked that. I liked crafting an argument. I liked being able to sort of see things from the other side and then understand, how to strategize that. I liked all of that stuff. But criminal law, I guess, sort of put me off it. Things got a little bit more real, and I got a bit of a taste of what it would be like to go and pursue that at university. So, and then I think as I was getting closer and closer to graduation, I could sense the freedom of leaving the leaving the social structures of high school. And the sort of limitations of suburban life, and sensing my impending adulthood, this thing that's just about to happen after graduating, and this freedom that I've looked at and been waiting for, of being openly gay, of being fully myself and showing up in the world, and with the freedom to do that in whichever way I wanted, which is, I guess, what I had always I had been missing and wanting since I was 5, So, so I guess I waited until really, really late. I think it was only maybe 2 or 3 months before graduating high school that I applied to study fashion. Really the only college in Quebec and in Montreal that teaches fashion in English. So I would have, had I wanted to go to any other school, I would have had to go to Toronto, for example. So I sent in an application, and they accepted me, and it was a private college, and it wasn't, my acceptance into that college wasn't in any way based on a kind of portfolio. You just had to pay for it, and there had to be enough places available for you to join, and that's really how it came in. But it felt kind of last minute, I think, mostly because I guess I was afraid to admit it to myself and admit it to my classmates that was truly what I wanted to commit myself to, you know, as a profession.
How did your parents take it? You know, like I can tell you that when I told my mother that I wanted to be an artist, my mom started to cry.
Oh, really?
Um, and not for the wrong reasons. She started to cry for the right reasons. She started to cry because she couldn't believe that her son, you know, someone who came from academics and economists, could actually become an artist. So for her, it was like the greatest thing in the world.
So she was crying.
Not so much
She
for my
was
dad.
crying of joy.
Yes, she
Five.
was crying of joy.
Wow, that's fab. I love that. That's so sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they really reacted. Um, yeah, I don't remember them having any kind of reaction to it. I don't think it meant much to them. Um, I don't think it would have made any difference had I gone to law school or fashion. I do, you know, I don't come from a family where the parents had any kind of defined expectations or ambitions for their children. It's not like, on one hand, it's nice because we weren't pressured to pursue a career that we didn't have any interest in. But on the other hand, it also, you know, we could have chosen to do anything and it maybe wouldn't have meant anything to them. You know, it wouldn't really have made much of a difference. Um, but yeah, no, I didn't get much of a response from either of them, but from my parents. But I do remember some people, like peers at school and high school, and I think a friend of my dad's best friend, his wife at the time, she was very interested in fashion. And my godmother wasn't necessarily interested in fashion, but she was a hairdresser and she had her own salon. She was always interested in beauty and always had a really keen eye for interiors and how she decorated her home and color. And both of them definitely said something where they're like, that makes more sense than law. Like, I can see you doing that. I do remember, however, my English teacher in high school was devastated to find out that I chose fashion because um, I had really enjoyed creative writing in high school, and I think I had won like an award or something in high school graduation or something like that. And he was very supportive of me writing, but in a way, you know, I already knew that what I was going to do in design was essentially the same thing as what I was doing in writing, but just in a different, you know, format. But I think he kind of saw fashion as a lesser form of creative expression than pursuing a career as an author of fiction, you know.
That's interesting because I think that there's obviously, having worked with so many fashion designers in my life, you know, it oozes creativity and thoughtfulness and the amount of research and the way of of exchanging concepts and ideas into free form is fantastic. So tell me, how was when you get to school, then when you get to university, how is that period of your life in terms of, did you feel like, oh my god, this is exactly what I wanted to do, this is what was missing in my life, or how was it?
Well, my two fashion, uh, like the two fashion schools I went to were like literal opposites, right? So in Canada, they're preparing you for the Canadian industry, which is not necessarily a high fashion or luxury or even like design. It's more of a clothing industry. So the focus is so much more on building clothes and manufacturing and fibers and the whole sort of system, operational system behind it, which is hugely important to know, and turns out to be massive. It turned out to be a huge asset for me, especially as I began my journey as an entrepreneur. Um, but it wasn't at all what I was hoping for. You know, I was really naive going into fashion college in Canada, thinking like I'm going to be able to finally express myself creatively, and the reality is it was a technical college degree. You know, it wasn't technically a degree, but it was a sort of college diploma where, you know, you really have to learn the technical operating skills. So, you know, pattern cutting classes were 5 hours long. Um, we would learn pattern cutting on a computer, on flat, on 3D. You know, we learned about, you know, we had a history of fashion course, which began at, you know, which began in caveman times. You know, we learned the what bone in the body, which of course now I forget, was used to hook a hide together, and where and why in that area of the hide is being clipped together. You know, it went all the way back there. So it was a very, very thorough, but really kind of type A operational education that um, really left very little room for creative expression. And so when you did get a little opportunity to do things as you wish, I would always sort of blow it up out of control. You know, so it's like, you know, they might allow you to choose the shape of the collar, the point of the collar on a classic button-down shirt. And of course, that corner of the collar, in my case, would go all the way down to the floor, you know? So it's kind of like just taking an inch and just running with it. And so, yeah, it wasn't what I expected, but it was important. And yeah, so it was, and then I went to Central St. Martin's, which was the opposite, where it was very much a sort of art school education. I mean, it, you know, literally is housed within the University of Arts London, and so it was lovely. I mean, in a way, it was a perfect balance of two extremes. You know, where one was entirely about authentic creative expression, and the other one was entirely about, you know, the hard-edged operational reality of a fashion business.
Yes, I
And
mean that's it.
that's
I find it amazing because it's you know, obviously you're saying it's a technical. It was a very technical degree.
yeah,
You
it
know.
was a very technical training to begin with, and so I did 3 years at a technical school, and then went to an art school where there were no rules and there was no, and you know, you could be on a master's course at Central St. Martin's and have some of your peers who have been in art school and in fashion education for years, you know, doing a foundation year, doing a 3-year bachelor's degree, maybe doing a gap year where they do an apprenticeship somewhere, and then finally doing a master's degree. And some of them don't actually know how to cut a pattern or how to sew anything. So it was, you know, it was a totally different environment for me to go from, you know, my education in Canada, and which is preparing you for a very mainstream commercial career, to Central St. Martin's, which was very much an art school. Um, and yeah, and noticing how different my process was. I knew how to build clothes. I knew how to make things that are in my mind into a three-dimensional thing that you can put on a body and you can wear. And that was pretty much, you know, when I started at St. Martin's, that was more or less the whole process. There wasn't really much to it other than that and sketching an idea. So I didn't really have any relationship to doing research in the classic way of like looking through magazines or art books or taking stills from films. It was so not that. It was always sort of just like plucking things from my imagination and putting them on paper in illustrated form, and then immediately starting to build clothes out of it. Now, of course, those things in my imagination are also a collage of something I saw in a movie once, and something I heard in a song once, or something I may have noticed when flicking through a magazine and not realize it. But the process of sort of documenting visual research and putting together mood boards and stacks of physical research was just so foreign to me. And instead, what I was doing was just constantly pattern cutting and sewing walls and building clothes and draping and fitting things, either trying them on myself or getting a fit model or one of the students, fellow students to come in and try stuff on.
How old were you at this point?
So I think I was 21 when I moved to London.
I was gonna say, are you still the youngest grad of the MA course, or has anyone come in and supplanted you from it?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if I would have even heard of it if that were the case. But yeah, I was really young and had never lived away from my parents. Didn't know what it was to live on my own yet, and yeah, it was a huge moment. But yeah, just getting back to your comment, this thing about the clothes, my work being well made. I don't know if I would say that well made is the first thing that comes to mind, but I think what people notice is that there was always an aspirational approach to building the clothes. That's for sure. It's not always that my intention was to create something objectively luxurious in the terms of it being like super well made in a classic sense. But there was always, always, always an ambition to create something that is technically advanced, in terms of like whether it be a seam or a proportion or how you assemble something in a more global sense. And I guess it's, I don't know if I was always hung up on it being good, but more I was preoccupied with it being like, I've always, and I do this still to this day, and it's not just in my work, but just generally, it's like, I'd rather people see me trying to do something and not quite nail it than for people to see me do something mediocre beautifully.
Yeah, I can testify for that one. I can tell you that much on what we try, all the things that we did together.
Yeah, I'd rather get on the rocket and aim for the moon and blow up on the way there than to just walk around the block a bunch.
Yeah. It makes. How was your okay, so there's two questions I have, but obviously let's go with what was it like for you as a 21-year-old arriving to London? Like, because this is what, 2010? No, 2008, 2009.
This was 2008, end of 2008. Yeah. So this was super exciting. I had been wanting to go to St. Martin's I had been obsessed with this journey that I've been planning and getting into the college and getting into the course and moving to the UK. And I'd been sort of going over and over and over in my mind this fantasy of doing this for like 2 full years. And so it was amazing when it happened. Like, I felt like I had been sort of revving my engine for 2 years, and finally I was allowed to catapult myself into this. But I think it was also like, I was so young, and so I didn't know myself. When you're that age, your only frame of reference is your childhood and your adolescence. You don't actually have any lived experience as an adult yet. So, it was funny to suddenly kind of be in a new country and in a totally different kind of environment that was creative and highly competitive and weirdly intimate at the same time, because the MA course is quite small. There really aren't that many students. And I guess it was a lot. It was a lot to take in. I think I put on a real brave face for a while, but I was for sure very insecure in many respects. And thinking back at it as well, it's sort of like I was still kind of like a child in a way. I had never had a romantic relationship. I'd never lived alone before. I didn't have any experience living life as an adult. And then suddenly you're in London. And I suppose because you're on the MA, which is such a prestigious course to get on, and they only take one Canadian a year, and you've taken out all these loans and you've won a scholarship to pay for it, and um, there's just so much riding on it. I guess the weight of responsibility that came with going to that, maybe it would have been different had I been there as a, or had I just gone and done a bachelor's degree in Toronto, or where it wouldn't have cost as much, or might not have cost anything. It might have been a very different kind of university experience. Maybe I would have, partied, or I don't know, been preoccupied with having the college years. But yeah, it was more like I definitely landed in London with, um, on one hand, this like huge appetite to express myself creatively for the first time in an environment that's totally free, which I didn't have at home growing up, and then I didn't have at college in Canada, and then suddenly you're at the pinnacle of it. You're at Central St Martin's, and you're in London, and it's also right before the industry. It was at the tail end, 2008, 2009, 2010. It was really at the tail end of a time in fashion where things were a lot looser. Now the industry, I mean, we're not talking about that long ago, but when you look at the transition that the industry has gone through since 2008, since that time when I moved to London, it's so different now. It's so much more commercial, and it's so much more mainstream, and the brands are so much bigger, and our understanding of what it is to be a fashion designer today is dramatically different to what it was back in 2008. And so, yeah, it was just kind of like such an incredible tension in the elastic of, I'm super young and I got this place on this competitive course, and I've just put myself into a literal lifetime of debt to be here, and as well as having a sponsorship or a scholarship to go, which is very prestigious, that I won in Canada. And at the same time, and knowing that there are so few people who are invited onto this course, and then on the other end of the elastic, it's like you've just been like a racehorse stuck in a stable your whole life, and it's like, now's your moment to finally be able to run, And I guess that's really where I started to run, is at St Martin's.
I moved to London at the beginning of 2008, and I remember the craziness and how it was such an amazing period of time and to be in London. That 2008 to like 2013, 2014, I think it was just an incredible period. So I feel your enthusiasm of that period of time, because it was amazing, and also in the fashion industry, the things that we were doing, and the characters that existed at that point in fashion, and the type of shows that were being done.
Yeah.
So
It's funny because I feel like when I got here, things were just starting to fizzle out, because when I was in Canada, after graduating from high school, like the 2005, 6, 7 era was really kind of like, there was definitely like a moment where London was a very, very hot scene for fashion and for youth culture. And there was definitely like a sort of, and Topshop was doing a big thing, and the sort of British models were having a moment, and the British London club kids scene was definitely having a moment. So there was a lot going on in London during those years when I was, in my late teens, just entering my 20s, and looking over at London as this place that I really wanted to be at, and this kind of microcosm of culture that I wanted to be a part of. And then when I got here, it was just kind of feathering out a little bit. It wasn't over, but it was not. I think it had already kind of peaked a little bit.
yeah, it was definitely the tail end of the whole shebang.
Yeah.
So then you graduate, yeah, and then this is when I had the pleasure of meeting you, which is.
So we met.
Talk to me about your first show.
Yeah, we met so early on. You were one of the first people that I got to meet And God, my first show. So, I mean, when I graduated, I mean, it was a really long time before anybody was offered a job. It wasn't a great time economically. So this was 2010. So we were kind of just coming out of the recession and the financial crisis, and and I also felt like, well, no one scooped me up and offered me a job, which I guess, you know, there's a certain kind of diluted entitlement when, you know, for St. Martin's MA graduates, where you think, oh, well, if there's any students that are going to get a job, it's us. And then, you know, we all kind of fell on our asses. But yeah, so there wasn't anything. I think, you know, had an opportunity to go and work in a studio at that time, like in Paris or in Milan or something, had that come up, I think I would have struggled to do anything other than say yes. You know what I mean? Like, I think that would have just been the practical. No, I don't come from money. I had just signed up for all of this debt, student loan debt. It would have made perfect sense to accept a job and go and find employment. But that just wasn't the moment we were in. And then I also suddenly found myself, well, I'm not going to school every day. And this thing I've been working towards for years, which is moving to London, going to St. Martin's and accomplishing this master's degree, I've just finished it. And I've just gotten to the finish line, and it seems like there's just nothing. And I think I had a bit of an existential wobble where it was sort of like, well, what do I do now? And the only thing that I knew to do was to just keep working and to keep expressing myself and designing and creating things. So I just immediately started working on a collection. And it wasn't necessarily like I'm starting a brand, but it was more like I have to do something. I can't just sit in my, you know, tiny apartment, flat share, and just hope that something falls out of the sky. I have to sort of keep busy and get to work and essentially give myself a sense of purpose. And so that's why and how I started working on my first collection, which was literally just like absolutely no money in the bank. Thankfully, I know how to technically make and build clothes, and I don't think it wasn't necessarily that I was particularly charming, but I was persistent enough to like keep hounding people for like sponsored materials and fabrics and knocking on doors. So I think I had the wherewithal to keep harassing people to help me rather than it was, you know, being charming or, you know, or anything like that. And then I got to meet you in that first show, and you know, it's funny because it's sort of like I'm now thinking back at it. I wonder, because you know me, I always have rather specific ideas of what I want and how I want things to look and feel. But truth be told, prior to meeting you, I don't know if I would have thought like, yeah, you need somebody to work with you on lighting, or you need somebody to work with you on staging. Like, I don't know if I would have even thought of that, you know.
It was an interesting conversation first time we met.
What do you remember?
But I remember meeting you in Hoxton Square,
Really?
and you're telling me that you had this gallery in East London,
Yeah.
and I had just done the wallpaper awards there earlier that year, so I knew everybody in there, so I knew a lot of the limitations that we were going to have.
Yes.
And every time I asked you, well, what about this? You're like, oh, I never thought of that. And what about this? Oh, I never thought about
Yeah.
that. What about this? Oh, I never thought about that. And I was like, okay. And because obviously you came recommended from the High Commissioner,
Yes.
who had also done an event at his house. And
See,
I remember having a conversation.
my memory for some reason was that we met there, but we didn't meet there. But we had that link because you knew Donna and Jim, who at Jim at the time was the High Commissioner of Canada in London. And so I had just been to their house to meet them as part of, I think it was, I can't remember, it might have been Sarah Mower or the British Fashion Council who were planning this sort of gathering at the Canadian Embassy. And of course, being the recent Canadian graduate, I was invited to join. But it's funny. I guess you were probably like, you were maybe accidentally such a sort of a vessel through which I learned a lot about the sort of operational side of putting a show together, because there was no production company and there was no budget.
Yeah, and I remember asking you like, okay, so what about the music? How's this gonna play? And all these things, which I was like, okay. And I remember talking to Muli, and I was like, Muli, yeah, there's this kid. He's a fashion designer. He has no money, and we're gonna support him. And he was like, okay, why? I was like, because sometimes you just need to pay forward.
Yeah.
And so, and that was kind of like the beginning of that. But I mean, I don't remember if I remember well. First show is in the gallery in East London, and that goes really well, by the way.
So that was
within
just to shout out Amanda Wilkinson, and that was Wilkinson Gallery on Viner Street, and Amanda Wilkinson is the owner, and it's still there, and it's an incredible contemporary art gallery, and it was the very first purpose-built contemporary art gallery in East London. And yeah, I just like I forever. I mean, the gratitude I feel for her today is exactly the same as it was then. It was just my favorite place to go and hang out in East London, which was close to where I lived, and to get to present your first show there, it was a dream come true. And I would have been happy for it to just be like, I mean, it literally was benches and one light. I think what we did.
It was benches and in 8 lights.
Yeah, it was really minimal, but I loved the space so much that I was like, I don't want to do anything to it. It was more about the environment than it was about like finding a venue to create something in.
And then is your second show, if I remember well, the one that we did upstairs at another gallery?
Yeah, so the second show was in a venue, and this was tricky because I think at that point, that's when, because my first show was off schedule, so you can't find it anywhere. You can't find it on Vogue Runway or anything like that. I mean, I think the Business of Fashion was maybe the only one who documented it or published anything about it. But my second season was when that's when things became a little bit more official, and so I was officially part of the schedule and had official sponsorship from the British Fashion Council and from the Centre for Fashion Enterprise, and Vogue Runway came to cover the show for the first time. So what was essentially my second show became known as my first or my debut collection, which is not actually the case. But that's kind of from that first season to the second where I understood like, oh, you did this show in East London, and I'd say about 50% of the conversation following the show was the fact that it was in East London. People made such a meal about the fact that this was in Hackney rather than in Mayfair. And I just remember thinking like, I just remember kind of like realizing that that's a big deal. Like I hadn't thought that that would be such an issue. But then, of course, now it makes sense where people are being chauffeured from one show to another with very little time between the two. Going all the way to East London for a show kind of is logistically impossible for a lot of people. I mean, I'm grateful that the turnaround was actually quite good for that first show in East London. But, I felt the pressure to participate more in how things are typically done and to be more part of the system of Fashion Week. And so that's why I showed at the Music Rooms in Mayfair, which is an adorable venue. But it was probably the show where I had the least hand in choosing the location, where it was the least creatively orchestrated for me. It was really kind of born out of practicality, where it's like, I don't remember who it was, but like someone must have sat me down and been like, okay, you've got a shot in hell. You need to make sure that this show is right in the middle of town so that all the right people can come. and it wasn't a big show. It was a pretty small show, but it got my foot in the door in terms of the sort of mainstream system of Fashion Week and Vogue Runway and getting the right butts in the right seats.
But I also think that at that point, because I remember that show very well. Because you might not remember this, but our budget was so limited, obviously, and I was talking to the rental company, and I had just done the McQueen
Yeah.
With Anna Winter, where she was presenting that there was going to be the Met exhibition. And I asked the rental company what was going to happen with those lights when we finished, and they said nothing. They're going back to the warehouse. And I shifted that return to the warehouse to come to your show, so we had extra lights for to cover elements of the show.
We did, but I think I remember us doing that a number of times, like piggybacking off of the bigger or like Topshop or something, where it's like, can we get them to let that fall off the shelf,
But I think that one thing that always struck me, about the shows that we did with you is they're always full of character.
Right.
We understood, we sat down and we understood where you wanted your main shots for the photographers.
Mm-hmm.
And then the rest of the spaces were always about how you wanted the clothes to look for the people.
Yeah.
Not about just the picture. It's like you almost kind of said, you deal with the picture and I will deal with the picture. And then you're like, let me deal with the rest of the space and figure out what we can do.
Yeah. I mean, the runway photo was never really it was important, but it was never top of list. And I suppose it's always been like that. Even when I was at St. Martin's, my MA collection, the entire concept of the collection was something that could only be seen from the profile. The whole silhouette was engineered to be seen from the side, which is, of course, is how you see a silhouette when you're sitting at a runway show with a conventional, runway. You see the models pass you from the side, but the photo is from the front, typically, and I didn't really care. I remember at St. Martin's, where one of my tutors were like, this is a huge risk, and to have the whole message of your collection be something that you can only see from the side, knowing that the photo is only going to be from the front, you should maybe rethink this. And I didn't, and I stuck to what I wanted to do. And even then, I started a brand, and it was always, it's not that I didn't care about the media documenting it. Yes, I did care, and I was always grateful to have press at the shows. But yeah, I have to hold my hand up. It was always more about the experience of being at the show and the feeling you got when you walked into the room, and the impact the music had, and the scent in the air, or the lack of scent, or and the pace of things. It was always more about creating a holistic sensory experience than it was about producing a flat product, such as a runway image.
So you do a few collections. Obviously, by now you have a brand. For better or for worse, suddenly you find yourself with a brand.
Right.
What did it mean? How did you deal with this? Because obviously, I did the same thing where suddenly I had to have a company, and suddenly I have a company, and God knows I was really, really, really crap at it at the beginning of what this is.
Yeah.
How did you feel about this idea of having a company?
I think there was a lot of it that was, I'll be honest, really, really quite exhausting. I think I didn't have the social skill set to be a boss yet, where I was very specific about what I wanted. I've always been a rather decisive person. I don't know always have an explanation or a reason behind why I want that over that, but I typically always know. You know, it doesn't take me long to know whether it's blue or pink, you know, or green or red. And when you're young and you don't have any money, that can be a hard pill for people to swallow because you are kind of coming in with a tone of authority and certainty, but you don't have any receipts to back it up. You know, you haven't paid your dues, if you wish. So I think kind of like knowing how to sort of show up as a boss and get things done and delegate work without having the sort of historical credentials to justify that maybe didn't always sit easily with me. And I think I was also, you know, I think at times, you know, I think at that age as well, when you're that young and you're not necessarily starting a brand because you want to be an entrepreneur, but you're starting a brand because you're a fashion designer and that's just what you feel pulled to do. I think I definitely didn't yet have the skill set to separate myself emotionally from the work and separate and have healthy boundaries with employees and understand when something needs to be looked at as a job and when something needs to be looked at as a personal endeavor. You know, that line was perhaps too blurred for a while, especially at the beginning. And so, yeah, I think it was challenging, I think, for my team as well, you know, whether it be interns or friends that were helping out or part-time staff and eventually full-time staff. I think it was challenging for people. I obviously can't speak for them, but I think I was maybe somebody who brought so much of themselves on an emotional and authentic level to work every day and poured so much of himself emotionally into the day-to-day work and the relationships at work that there was this kind of feeling of like I never shied away to show my vulnerability to my team or like to show that I was maybe struggling with something at work. But then when it comes time to make a decision about something, I don't hesitate and I shoot to kill, you know, where I just go directly to what I want. And that's that. And that kind of contrast of Thomas being a little bit of a weeping willow and then also being this kind of razor sharp person with a vision that he's not prepared to compromise on. I think sometimes it was challenging for me to sort of balance those two sides of my personality in that kind of environment of being an entrepreneur.
I can see that. I mean, I think that there's also, because you were always so clear, I think, you know, especially in the size that I had to deal with you, which was shows, you always had a very clear idea of what you wanted.
Yeah.
And then it was just a matter of understanding how in the world are we going to get there with the budget that we have? Yeah. And what are the compromises that we're going to have to make?
Yes.
But I think that there's an element of authenticity that happened in every single one of those shows, which is why we, you know, they were always one of the highlights of our fashion week, you know, in terms of what are we going to do, how we're going to break the rules this time, because that's really what we were doing with you. Yeah. We were breaking the rules in every possible way. What's the show that you did that you kind of said, or maybe internally you thought like, oh gosh, I made it?
Well, I never thought about I made it in terms of like in a macro way of like my career, I've made it. And honestly, I don't know if I'll ever get to that point in my career or in my life. You know, I don't really sort of like, I'm almost afraid of being in that state of mind. Like now I've made it. And it's like, then what? You're just going to blow your head off, you know? So, but the one show that really sticks out in terms of like having had a vision and having the result of the show and the experience of the show be exactly what you wanted it to be was the show we did together in St. James, where I think it would have been my autumn winter 2013 collection. I think it might have been 2013. So that I had done a really aggressive beeline towards performance wear for that season. So it was all this tech materials, tech fabrics, down filling, bonded seams, etc. So it was a very tech heavy, almost kind of like literally sporting goods kind of collection. And we were lucky to have a sponsored venue that was sponsored by the Crown Estate. And it was this really, really long car park. And I mean, it was probably, I think it was 2.5 minutes to walk at a runway speed from one end to the other. So it was like a super, super long runway. And all of the guests were crammed at one end of this corridor style car park in tiered seating, like stadium style seating. And we decided to hide all of these LEDs, these strips of LED lights, behind all of the pillars that ran like a sort of vertebrae along the ceiling of the entire length of the car park. And I guess like I had gone to visit the space and I had seen all of these beams and this kind of row, like a domino on the ceiling of beams that were perfectly spaced out, and suddenly had this flash idea of doing this sort of robotic, programmed, trippy sort of movement of light that's hidden inside the structure of the space, which was, and I'm sure you'd noticed this, I always wanted to hide the lights. I never wanted us to see the actual light. I wanted just to see and experience the light, but I didn't want anyone to see the physical light structure. Whenever possible, I wanted to hide it. And when you don't have a budget to build a set from scratch, you can't really do that most of the time. So this venue was perfect for that because you could hide the LEDs behind each one of those concrete beams on the ceiling because they had a sort of ledge, a recessed ledge. And that show, I mean, it's the only time where, I mean, first of all, you went in with your guys before, I think the day before, and set everything up. And I was constantly, especially leading up to a show, just operating in this state of hypervigilance where I was just, just purely running on anxiety and just constantly looking for the next thing that's going to fuck up, the next thing that's going to break or not work or not get delivered or, so it was just I would always spend the better part of a month in that state of mind leading up to a show. And then on the morning of the show, when we arrived and started setting up the backstage, I went into the venue and you and your boys had done such a seamless job. There was absolutely no trace of any work having been done. Like you couldn't tell that anything had been set up at all. And I was convinced that the lights hadn't been set up. And there must have been over 100 beams, so it was kind of like, and having to put up a ladder at each one and move the ladder along, like just the sheer amount of work that needs to go into creating something like this. So I was convinced that it didn't happen. I remember calling you and being like, where are the lights? And you were like, they're in. They've already been set up. They're done. And I was so relieved. But my point is, you then arrived and showed me how the lights work, and we began to play around with programming not only the movement of the lights, but the color composition of how we transition from one color radiating to another, etc. The whole collection in terms of the show, in terms of its music, and the soundscape and the sort of venue and the lighting was very much a sort of Brazil, like that film Brazil in 1984. And it was very much like a kind of like a little bit Argento as well, of, this kind of flashes of different types of color, and this kind of like disco horror kind of feeling, sort of sci-fi disco horror kind of vibe. Anyway, and so you showed me how the lights work, and I was so moved, and because it was really the first time, and that's not to say that I wasn't happy and proud of what we had done prior to this, but it was really the first time where this was exactly what I had imagined. I mean, if not better. And I had to excuse myself, and I went out to the back lot, and I had a cry on my own. I had a cry
I remember
of
that.
relief. And yeah, it was really the first time where I had been so moved by someone's, not just somebody's work in terms of like their ability to deliver on something, but somebody's like feeling really seen and feeling really heard. Like I had a very clear idea of what I wanted, and I knew it was really ambitious and labor intensive, as things typically are with me. And here's this wonderful man who just knew how to be inside my head and completely understood what I wanted, and made it happen in a way that was so seamless that I was convinced none of the work had actually been done yet when I arrived. You know, I mean, that was probably like the within the framework of my brand, like one of those ultra privileged experiences where it was just like, God, how lucky am I to be able to have experiences like this, working with other creatives who are so technically proficient.
I think that there's, for me, obviously you've always been part of our history, and I always said that every time you won an award, which by the way, I think you won everything single possible thing any human can actually win.
Yes,
We always took it as
that was
a
my
little badge of
insecurity
honor.
showing. Anybody who's winning that many awards obviously has a chip on their shoulder.
But then, it's like, I think for me it was when we did that show near uh Green Park, in a house just
Yes,
off the
yeah,
park,
that was a beautiful.
which was the first time that a lot of my friends were photographers
Mm,
for all the important magazines started to show up.
yeah, yeah,
It was like, okay, if you guys are coming, this means Thomas is growing.
yeah,
For me, that was a really interesting moment. Also because I remember that the night before you were downstairs with the team still making clothes because the fabric for 2 or 3 of the dresses had just
yeah.
arrived.
Of course.
And it was like seeing this, seeing how engaged you were with everything, and then seeing the seeing the industry acknowledging it. I think for me that was like the time that I thought, okay, he's he is now being seen, which was great, to be part of that journey with you. So
It's funny.
then you go and do.
Sorry, I
Hmm?
interrupted you.
No, no, go for it, go for
No,
it.
I was just gonna say it. It's funny to hear you talk about it in that way because it's like I was so unaware of who people were, and I still have plenty of blind spots as well, and this is definitely a theme in my life and something I think about fairly regularly is like wanting to protect a certain amount of your naivety, like wanting to protect a certain amount of your creative curiosity. Of I don't necessarily always want to know everything. Um, it's sort of like it's a bit like the other side of the coin of like not meeting your heroes, where somebody's work means so much to you, and you're almost afraid to meet them because your relationship with their work is more valuable to you than getting to know them as a person somehow. Where it was sort of like I've always, whether consciously or not, wanted to preserve a certain amount of my not knowing all of the backstory of the industry or what everybody is. So a lot of the times when I was, when things like that were happening, where the right press were coming to the show, or the right interviewer critic was interviewing me or something like that, most of the time I didn't know who these people were. And I think that helped me in some respects. I think my relationship with Kathy Warren, who's still a good friend, and has been such a kind of pretty solid supporter of mine from the start of my career. When she and I first met, I had no idea who she was. I didn't know that she was working at the New York Times. I had no sense of the importance of this conversation. And I'm grateful that I was so naive. That's the beauty of it, where you can just sit with somebody and have a conversation and not be preoccupied with, molding yourself into a shape with this assumption of what it is they're looking for or who they are. But then on the other hand, there have been so many experiences where I've not known somebody or who somebody is. And my naivety has almost sort of insulted them, where it's sort of like, it's kind of, it's worked against me to not be informed.
But I think that naivety is what allowed us to do, the show at the Foreign Office, or the show at the skate park, or the show with the projections, and the everyone sitting around, and nothing in the middle, and where's the photographers, and I think that part of that naivety in a way allowed you to be very fresh and do whatever you wanted to do, because sometimes you didn't know what the correct ways were, and then you had the rest of us to help you navigate the elements that were a no and make sure that those things happen while still maintaining that naivety that you had.
For sure. And it's something that I still I'm still conscious of, and has its place in my career today, and also in my relationships, working in different fashions, in different ways with different companies, or this, for me, the importance of like understanding the opportunity you have in your limitation. Sometimes we came up with something really interesting because we just didn't have the cash to get what we had wanted in the first place. So we had to make a compromise, but the compromise turned out to be nice. That's an obvious, easy example. But, I'm currently doing some work behind the scenes for the next 2 years with a mainstream sports company. It's a performance wear brand, which is something I've always been curious about. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and it will eventually be something that the public is aware of, but we're kind of in a 2-year preparation stage. And they're a brand, I don't have the figures, but they're a kind of brand in terms of a scale of revenue, are bringing in probably about anywhere between 2 and 3 billion euros a year. So they're a good size brand. And this is something I've mentioned to them, and I've mentioned repeatedly, is that you are not huge in that it's such a huge ship that you can't really move, or if you do, it has to be in a siloed department somewhere relatively small, and it's just going to get lost in the soup. But you're also not small, and I talk about the scale of this business in a way that's such an asset, where it's like you're big enough to do something really well without having to make any super significant compromises, but you're small enough to do something specific, or small enough to do something, for lack of better terms, weird, or slightly against the status quo. The thing, once you get yourself into the sort of Nike scale or Adidas scale or New Balance scale, where you're looking at sort of 15, 18, 20, 30 billion dollar revenues, that's, you're not working with a city anymore, you're working with a continent, so it's far more difficult to sort of try something new and be curious and make a mistake, or, so I'm really enjoying that. But, so whether it be working, as I used to with my tiny brand with no budget, or working with a brand that is, in the sort of billion euro mark, this that psychology of like understanding, the freedom that comes from scale, whether that be because you have the means to get exactly what you want, or the freedom or the opportunity that might come from a certain limitation, or sort of like we're not mainstream enough to worry that this is going to be out of context. We don't, not everything we do has to be directly in service always to, um, or be immediately on the obvious track towards commercial success in the way that we know it. It's like we can still play.
That's very nice. Yeah, I guess it's the element of understanding where you sit in the entire ecosystem and what are the possibilities within that.
Yeah,
Like you said, I think sometimes trying to move a big company towards something becomes very difficult because there's an entire structure and people need to make decisions. And then if you're too small, sometimes you don't have the budgets or you don't have the opportunities or the spaces to kind of make those things because of the nature of it. So,
yeah,
and
and
it's
that's the thing. It's like I think one thing that really I learned so much about working with you and doing things how I did things with my brand, being so young, having no money, having no entrepreneurial credentials prior to that. You just throw yourself in head first, but you realize like everything is a favor. Everything, you realize that when you don't have a budget, the only reason anyone is here. I mean, nobody was an idiot. Everybody understood. Like, no one ever worked with me because they were eyeing up a paycheck. They knew that it was, if there was a paycheck, it was tiny and to be considered a sort of gesture um, of gratitude. But there was, no one was mining for a paycheck working with me. Everyone had to be involved because they believed in the work, they wanted to support the vision, they wanted to be a part of something. The driver was always either the work from a sort of creative, emotional point of view, or the relationship from a sort of interpersonal sort of connection of liking collaborating with somebody, liking spending time with somebody, and and I'll be honest, there were definitely times where I wish the budget was there so that I didn't feel as bad just putting my foot down and asking for what I want. I often felt like I had to seduce people into liking the idea, or I had to sell the idea to people in order to get them emotionally on board with it. And that's really taxing, when you have to lead by encouragement rather than lead by this kind of financial carrot at the end of the stick. It's very different. It teaches you a very different style of leadership to pay your way into what you want, or to persuade people to get on board with you about something, towards something.
You definitely got us to do a lot of those things for you because we believed in it. At the end of the day, there's a massive belief on going for it and creating
Yeah.
something out of the passion rather than by the paycheck.
Yeah, and I talk about this, but I think it's important in any time when I'm having a conversation about something like this is to also call out the elephant in the room, which is also the privilege aspect. I grew up in a very nice country called Canada, where we had access to free education and free healthcare, and things were safe. I got to go to arguably the best design school in the world at a young age. I got a sponsorship. I'm also white. I'm tall. I'm thin. I'm not hideous. I'm male. All of those things are privileges, and I'm very much aware. Yes, I work very hard, and I continue to. Um, and I definitely broke my back a couple of times in my 20s, trying to stake my claim on this industry or build a space for myself in this industry. It wasn't easy, but I think how grueling it was and how much I pushed myself and how tiring it was to do that. I imagine, what if I didn't have all of those privileges? What if I wasn't who I am from where I am? What if I didn't look the way I did? What if I wasn't in this shell? Would it have even been possible? Or how painful it would have been, even more than that. So it's sort of like, I always want to take a little moment when I speak with people about my accomplishments and the hard work that I've done. And also kind of say, like, yeah, there's also an element of it which is absolutely privilege. I'm conscious of that, and I think we need to talk about that. We need to acknowledge it.
Thank you to Thomas for the conversation. If you'd like to dive deeper, head to our Substack, glyph-podcast, for show notes, links, and extras. You can also follow us on Instagram and TikTok at glyph-podcasts. If you'd like to see a video of this conversation, head over to our YouTube channel. My name is thomas-tait. See you next time.